Hello, I'm Dr. Richard Scott Noakes, and I would like to talk to you a little bit today about this first chapter, What is Language? And I'd like to give some context about the history of the English language, as is often called HEL, H-E-L, History of the English Language. It's been called that as a joke by undergraduates for generations now, I think. Um, and the first thing is really to ask the question, why are we studying this at all? For many of you, this is a required course because of some sort of state requirements that you have to do, or just because you need to fulfill a gap in your curriculum. And so why is this here? Why do we even study this at all? And I think there are kind of four main reasons. One is if you're a teacher, and most of the students who will take this class are trained to be teachers, it's important for you to understand why students are facing certain kinds of language issues, and it helps you to deal with those. And it's not just the international students or foreign-speaking students who you'll be dealing with, but also students who are native speakers of English but struggle with certain aspects of the language. Studying the history of the language really gives you a context for that and helps you to understand it better. Also, of course, if you are working with speakers of foreign languages, whether you are working as a translator, as a teacher, just someone who has to travel a lot for your job, history of the English language points out a lot of the invisible assumptions that we have in English, assumptions that you don't even know that you have because you and everyone around you shares them. But it helps you see those more clearly and therefore to really understand your other language better. If you're an editor, there are these rules of grammar and spelling, and they appear to be entirely arbitrary, and they don't have any context. This really gives you context, so you know what is arbitrary, what is not, the history of those rules, where they come from, and sometimes why something is a rule and why something else similar is just a matter of style. And then if you're a writer, which presumably on some level, whether you write professionally or just as a sort of side part of communicating your job, understanding the history of words themselves really helps you understand the deeper and the subtler effects of the choices that you make in terms of your word and your language. Now, really, historical linguistics as we understand today kind of grows up in the 19th century. But it did exist before that. So, even in the days before Christ, so in the mid-600s BC, very famously, F.R.O. Samtik conducted a very famous language deprivation experiment where he took two children, he sort of shut them off from the rest of the world with only a deaf and mute woman to care for them so that they would develop their own language. He thought that was a way to get at this sort of the first language. And of course they did develop their own language. Something that you'll quickly learn is that language is essentially human. And if you put two humans together, they will develop language together. Around 400 BC, Panini composed a grammar of Sanskrit, which is called Astayani, or sometimes called the 8 books. And this is a very important thing, which later on becomes important for helping us understand the Indo-European language family. Then around 400 BC, Plato kind of argues that meaning in language comes from natural processes, and then his student Aristotle then later connects the idea of language and reasoning or thought in Greek with the word logos. Now, jumping ahead into the Middle Ages, and then we have our first Arabic grammar produced around 700 AD. Cormac MacCullenan produces the first etymological dictionary called Cormac's Glossary around 900 AD. The first one that really traces the history of words themselves. And around 1300 AD, Dante of the Divine Comedy, he argues that language evolves naturally and has to be put in its kind of cultural historical context, and he creates a linguistic map of Europe. And so then, moving ahead, we have some really important things that happen really in the 19th century, and a lot of this has to do with really the British conquest of India. In 1786, Sir William Jones suggests that Sanskrit and Persian are related to Latin, Greek, and some other European languages. Essentially what happens is you've got all these people who who are English, and so they speak, as you'll find out later, what's a Germanic language. They have studied Latin and Greek, a Romance language, and an Attic language, and they then go to India, where they run into these Indic languages there. And so these people who, as a happy side effect for us of all this, is they start to notice these similarities and think these similarities must mean something. In the 1820s, a guy by the name of Wilhelm von Humboldt argues that all languages are governed by certain rules. And this is an important insight, that languages are governed by rules. In 1822, Jakob Grimm developed something called Grimm's Law, which we're not going to get into right now. It'll become very important in later chapters. And then in the late 19th century, Carl Brugmann argues that sound change is regular. It's not just governed by certain laws, but it's regular, and it's governed by something he called sound law. So what are some of the principles that you need to know coming into this? Well, one thing that many students find confusing from the beginning is this idea. Writing is not language. I'm going to repeat that because it gets very confusing when you forget this. Writing is not language. Writing is a representation of language, but it is not language itself. And, you know, especially if you're an English major, this seems counterintuitive to you, but it is indeed the truth, and that's something you're going to have to remember. Chapter 2, when you study IPA, it's to get around the problem that writing is not language, to try to represent the sound rather than the way the squiggles are on the page, in essence. It's also important, and this chapter 1 gets at this, language is human, and also languages are cultural. Now, what do I mean by those two things at the same time? Well, one is, if you're a human, you develop language. Really, the only way that humans, a human sort of normally mentally developed baby doesn't develop language is if they're isolated from speakers and they never hear anyone speak. And then they won't develop mentally properly at all. You know, you put humans together, we develop language. We just can't stop ourselves. So to have language itself is essentially human. However, languages, the particular languages, are cultural and conventional. So I speak language because I am human. I speak English because I was raised in a society that where English was the dominant language. So it's important to know that it's both, that there are different elements of it. You have language because you're human. You have your particular language because of your own culture. Also, as we heard before, the idea that language change is governed by certain immutable laws of nature. This is something which, especially people who are English majors, will sometimes be confused about. We're used to things being a little more subjective than that. But a lot of things in historical linguistics are simply facts. There's no getting around them. When a sound changes, if one particular sound changes in a particular context in one word in a language, all the other sounds in that context will change in exactly the same way, you know, as the language develops. And because of that, language change also is inevitable. We very often will see these movements to stop language change. We have to keep our language pure. We have to keep our language you know, from having corruption or foreign influence, or keep it the same as it was. You can't stop it. Language change is inevitable, and this is one of the ways that we end up with different sorts of languages. And when we talk about fast language change, one thing I think that sometimes when you're studying this, the students become confused about is fast language change, even then, is gradual. As a language changes, a fast change in language still takes place over a couple generations. So in most language changes, slower than that. So for example, any one person, unless they emigrate to a place where they speak a different language, any one person, they believe that they speak the same language as their grandparents, and they believe they speak the same language as their grandchildren. In their lifetime, they're never going to think these people speak a different language than me. They probably won't even notice anything beyond, you know, sort of slangy vocabulary differences in their lifetime. But the change is always happening. The change is always occurring. And it's also important to know that because language and dialect are conventions that are governed by community, it's affected by geography. If you look at a map, it doesn't take you long to realize that different languages are spoken in different areas of the world. And that is not really so much a political cause, but more because of language conventions. You speak the way that the community around you speaks. And so because of that, if you don't live near anyone who speaks a particular language, you're not going to be exposed to it, and it's not going to affect your language at all. Today, that has a slightly different meaning, as we'll get to in much later in the term. But early on, that literally meant if you lived on one side of the mountain and another people who spoke the same language as you lived on the other side of the mountain, and you really didn't communicate with each other very much because of that big mountain between you, then over the generations, your two languages would drift off into different ways until finally you have two very different kinds of languages. So I just want to, as we're looking at chapter one is a particularly, I think sometimes students look at this and they think, well, it has these sort of ethereal questions. What is language? And these are important conceptual ideas. We move from this, we're going to get into the more sort of hardcore aspects of the history of the English language.